Sometimes a single night can change everything. One lonely cowboy, one woman running for her life, and 70 armed men who would stop at nothing. We're just a few steps away from reaching 1,500 subscribers, and we'd be honored to have you with us. Thank you to every kind soul who's joined us so far. With your support, we share peaceful, heartfelt stories that warm the soul. If you enjoy calm, meaningful stories, don't forget to subscribe. You're part of this family now. Now, make yourself comfortable. It's time for the story. The wind cut across the frozen plains like a blade, carrying with it the low moan of winter. Snowflakes drifted in spirals, soft as falling ash, coating the logs of a lonely cabin standing against the storm. From its chimney rose a thin line of smoke, wavering into the gray sky, a fragile sign of life in a world drowned by silence. Inside, Daniel Cross sat near the fire, his tall frame bent slightly forward, rough hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee more for warmth than for taste. Daniel had grown accustomed to solitude. Too many graves had marked the chapters of his life, parents buried before their time, a wife claimed by fever, and no children to soften the silence that followed. His days were measured by the sound of his boots on wooden planks, the groan of leather straps when he saddled his horse, and the endless rhythm of wood splitting against an axe. Loneliness had ceased to feel like punishment. It was simply the shape of his life. That evening was no different until the silence cracked. At first it was faint, nearly lost in the storm, the thudding of hooves across the snow. Daniel straightened, the cup slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the table. Moving to the narrow window, he pushed aside the patchwork curtain. The world outside was a blur of white, the skeletal trees bowed under ice, yet the sound grew clearer. Hoofbeats. They did not belong to wandering deer. Someone was out there, riding through a storm no sane man would challenge. He waited, breath held. The sound faded. Then came another softer, broken. The sound of human breath struggling against the cold. A shadow stumbled into his yard, staggered once, and collapsed face first into the snow near the porch. Daniel's heart, long dulled by grief, jolted like a hammer strike. Snatching his coat, he swung the door open and stepped into the storm. The figure lay half buried, dark hair crusted with snow, thin garments soaked and clinging to a frail frame. Daniel knelt, turning the stranger gently. A woman. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, eyes half closed, body trembling with violent shivers. She tried to speak, but only broken whispers spilled from her mouth. Without a word, Daniel lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, as if life itself was already slipping away. He carried her inside, the cabin door slamming shut against the storm. Setting her on the cot near the fire, he wrapped her in a quilt. At first, she resisted weakly, as though kindness itself frightened her, but the last of her strength gave out, and she surrendered to the warmth. Daniel ladled broth from the pot simmering on the hearth and held the spoon to her lips. She sipped cautiously, eyes darting to him, uncertain whether to trust or fear. Then, with effort, she spoke a single word clear enough to strike him silent. Chase. The meaning was sharpened when she added a second breathless word. Kill. Daniel stiffened. He knew the kind of men who roamed the plains. Settlers who spoke of law but practiced cruelty. Men who drew lines between themselves and anyone they called a stranger. If they hunted her, they would not stop. The woman, her voice soft, her accent foreign, said her name was Leanne. She had worked in a settler household, treated as labor instead of guest, enduring scorn until she fled. The family she left behind had branded her a thief, a liar, and now chased her as though she were nothing but property. Daniel listened in silence, his jaw tightening. He had seen injustice often enough to recognize its stench. He offered no false comfort, only his presence. The fire crackled, the storm battered the cabin walls, and the woman's breathing steadied as warmth began to return to her fragile body. Yet unease grew heavier inside him. The hoofbeats he had heard were not imagination. Men had been riding in the storm, searching, and now, by some twist of fate, their prey lay under his roof. That night passed in uneasy quiet. Daniel sat in his chair with his rifle within reach, the woman asleep on the cot. Each gust of wind against the window felt like a hand testing the walls, searching for weakness. He did not sleep. His instincts told him that by dawn, the storm would not be the only threat pressing against his cabin. When the first pale light seeped across the snow, he stepped outside to check the yard. Tracks scarred the ground, many tracks circling near the ridge. His chest hardened. Whoever had followed Lien had not turned back. They were waiting, watching, gathering. Daniel returned inside, the rifle still in his hand. Lien stirred awake, clutching the quilt, her dark eyes searching his face for answers. He said nothing, only set another log on the fire. But in his silence, a decision had already been made. The moment he had lifted her from the snow, his quiet life had ended. And by the look of those tracks outside, the storm was only the beginning. The storm still raged the following day, but its howl no longer masked the danger outside. Daniel knew the tracks he had seen were not from passing riders, they were scouts, men who tested the edges of his land before returning with word of what they had found. And what they had found was him. And Lien. Inside, the fire burned bright, yet unease pressed heavier than the cold. Lien sat upright on the cot, quilt wrapped tightly around her frame. Her dark eyes followed Daniel's every movement, not with suspicion now, but with the nervousness of someone bracing for what must come. She had lived too long with cruelty to believe kindness could last without cost. Daniel moved about his chores with deliberate calm, stacking wood, checking the latch on the window, tightening the bar across the door. But inside, his thoughts ran like a river in flood. He had stood against hardship before, blizzards, sickness, hunger. Yet men were different. A storm obeyed no master, but men chose their cruelty, and cruelty armed with rifles was harder to weather than snow. By midday, the storm thinned enough that the world beyond the cabin appeared once more. Through the shifting white, Daniel spotted faint shapes moving on the ridge riders, too many to count. They did not charge, not yet. They watched, circling like wolves testing the strength of prey before the kill. Lien noticed his stiffened posture as he lowered the curtain. Her lips parted, but no words came. She had seen that look before, men weighing the line between standing and running. She whispered instead, voice trembling, "If I go, they leave you." Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady, jaw set like stone. "If they'll hunt you, they'll hunt me. Best they learn I don't bend." For a long moment, she stared at him, as though trying to measure whether he meant it. And in his silence, she found her answer. Her breath caught, the disbelief in her face softening into something else. Fragile but real. Trust. The hours crept by in tense quiet. Lien helped where she could, gathering small wood, folding blankets, even mending a strap under his instruction. Each small act was defiance, proof that she would not cower. Daniel watched her with a mix of admiration and grim resolve. She was no longer just a fugitive in his cabin, she was someone worth standing for. Toward evening, a sharp knock rattled the door. Lien froze, eyes wide, clutching the quilt to her chest. Daniel unbarred it carefully, rifle in hand, and pulled it open to reveal an old woman wrapped in furs. Martha Hale, his nearest neighbor, though she lived miles away. Snow clung to her gray hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stepped inside briskly, setting down a basket of dried apples and jerky. Her eyes immediately fell on Lien, and for a moment, the air in the cabin thickened. But Martha did not scold or question. Instead, her gaze softened. She placed a weathered hand gently on Lien's shoulder and spoke low. "Fear feeds the cold more than hunger does. Rest here." The simple kindness struck Lien harder than cruelty ever had. Her breath shook, her lips parted, but no words would come. Martha gave Daniel a look heavy with meaning. "Word is spreading. Pike and his men are hunting. 70 strong, or near enough." Daniel's jaw tightened. He did not need her warning, but hearing it aloud settled the weight deeper. Martha stayed only long enough to press the basket into his hands. "They'll come soon. Choose your stand." Then she left, her tracks swallowed quickly by the storm. As night closed in, the cabin seemed smaller yet warmer. Lien moved with more confidence now, helping to arrange kindling, folding the few clothes Daniel owned. He watched her quietly, realizing his cabin no longer felt like a tomb of silence. It held breath, warmth, life. But as the fire burned low, Lien's sharp gasp woke him from his thoughts. She pointed toward the window, eyes wide with fear. Daniel rose, rifle in hand, and drew back the curtain. Through the curtain of snow, torches glimmered on the ridge. At first, faint as fireflies, then more. Dozens. A line of flame weaving through the white, crawling closer. The storm had hidden them through the day, but night revealed their intent. 70 men, or near it. Lien's trembling voice barely rose above the crackle of fire. They come. Daniel lowered the curtain slowly, his expression carved from iron. He knew then what the night would bring. There would be no peace, no bargain. Only the test of how much one man and one woman could endure against the cruelty of 70. He set another log on the fire. Its glow rose tall and defiant, the only answer he could give to the gathering dark. The glow of torches on the ridge burned through the night like a jagged necklace of fire, each spark carried by a man who believed numbers would give him power. Inside the cabin, Daniel sat with his rifle across his knees, his body still though his pulse hammered in his ears. Lien knelt by the hearth, feeding slender pieces of wood into the flames, her hands trembling yet deliberate. The shadows thrown by the fire made the room feel smaller, the air thicker, as though even the walls waited for the first gunshot to split the silence. Every creak of timber made them glance at the door. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters felt like a fist pounding against the cabin. Yet the attack did not come. The men outside circled, testing their prey, drawing out fear as a cruel sport. Lien sat back, her face pale, her eyes never leaving Daniel. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "If I stay, they will kill you." Daniel turned his head slowly, his eyes steady on hers. "This house doesn't bow. Not for them. Not for anyone." The words sank into her like embers pressed to frost. She had heard promises before, false ones whispered by men who used kindness as bait. But Daniel's voice was different, not loud, not desperate. It was iron dragged across stone, steady and unyielding. For the first time, she believed. Morning broke pale and gray. The torches had vanished into the dark, but deep tracks scarred the snow in proof. They were still there, waiting. As Daniel stepped outside to fetch hay for the horse, he found more signs, hoof prints pressed deep, the smell of smoke from campfires just beyond the ridge. They had not left. They were tightening the noose. Inside, Lien busied herself folding blankets, her movements sharp with nervous energy. When Daniel entered, she searched his face for any sign of hope. He gave her none, but he gave her truth. "They've seen us. They'll come." Her lips trembled. "Then I must go. Alone. Better me than you." Daniel's jaw set, his voice low but fierce. "If they'll harm you, they'll harm me. If they drive you back, they'll come for me next. A man only lives by the stands he makes." Before she could answer, a knock thundered against the door. Lien froze, clutching the quilt to her chest. Daniel motioned for silence, unbarred the door, and opened it just enough to reveal Jonas Crane, the town's marshal. Snow clung to his shoulders, his badge catching the weak light. His expression was grave as he glanced past Daniel into the cabin. His eyes lingered on Lien before hardening back to Daniel. "You've taken her in," he said flatly. Daniel said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Crane exhaled slowly, his breath steaming in the air. "Pike's men claim she's theirs. Say she stole from them. Say she ran from lawful hire. They're 70 strong. You know I can't hold them back, not alone." Daniel's voice was calm, rough as gravel. "Then I'll stand alone." The marshal studied him, respect flickering in his eyes though regret weighed his voice. "You'll make enemies, Daniel. The kind who don't forget." Daniel's answer was plain. "Then they'll remember." Crane gave a faint nod, tipped his hat, and rode off, leaving only the hollow crunch of hooves fading into the snow. Lien stood near the fire, her hands pressed tight together, trembling. She had understood enough of the exchange to know what choice Daniel had made. Her breath caught as she whispered, "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" Daniel looked at her, the firelight sharpening the lines of his face. "Because living without standing is worse than dying on your feet." Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, ashamed of what she thought weakness. Yet Daniel saw only strength in her gaze, the strength of someone who had been broken and yet still endured. That evening, the storm quieted, but the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Daniel taught Lien how to load wood into the fire so it burned longer, how to mend leather with careful stitches, how to hold a knife steady should the door break. She listened, learning with a focus born of desperation, her hands trembling less with each task. When dusk deepened, Daniel sat by the window, watching the ridge. His breath stilled when he saw its torches again, dozens of them, creeping closer. A horn's low cry carried through the frozen air, deep and cruel, echoing like the roar of a beast. Lien's fingers clutched his sleeve. He rose, rifle in hand, shoulders broad against the doorway. The firelight carved his shadow long across the cabin wall. The riders were coming, and this time they would not circle. The horn's echo lingered across the frozen land, rolling like thunder that refused to fade. Daniel stood at the doorway, rifle in hand, his breath a steady cloud in the bitter air. Lien clung to his sleeve for a moment, then pulled back, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders like armor. Her eyes were wide, but behind the fear there was something else, resolve, faint but growing. The torches spread out across the ridge, a line of fire stretching into the night. 70 riders, their horses stamping impatiently, their voices sharp with laughter that cut through the silence like knives. At their center rode Caleb Pike, the man Daniel had expected. Coarse-bearded, eyes gleaming with cruelty, Pike sat tall in his saddle and lifted a torch high. His shout carried through the snow-filled air. "Cross. Hand her over. She's ours." Daniel did not move. His voice when it came was low but steady, each word an iron weight. "A man is no man who owns another." The outlaws jeered, their torches rising higher. Pike spat into the snow, his sneer twisting. "She's a thief, a liar, property dressed up like a woman. Step aside, or you'll die with her." Daniel leveled his rifle, the firelight glinting on the steel. "This house stands for the living. You'll not take her while I breathe." The moment cracked like glass under a hammer. A single shot split the night, shattering a cabin window and splintering wood. Daniel pulled Lien down behind the frame and fired back in one swift motion. A rider fell from his horse, his torch hissing out in the snow. The circle wavered, but Pike's voice lashed them forward. "Take the cabin. Burn it down." Gunfire erupted. Bullets struck the logs, sending splinters flying. Sparks leapt from the hearth, smoke filling the air. Daniel fired with the precision of a man who had hunted storms all his life, every shot deliberate, every movement steady despite the chaos. Lien crouched beside him, pressing cloth to a graze along his arm, her hands shaking but determined. The roar of hooves thundered closer when suddenly another voice rose above the storm of gunfire, sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. "Pike, stand down." Through the blizzard of flame and smoke rode Marshal Jonas Crane, badge catching torchlight, rifle raised high. His horse stamped and blew steam into the frozen air as his voice thundered again. "There is no law and 70 guns against one cabin. If you make it so, you answer to me." Pike's laugh rang cruel. "Law is what men like me say it is. And tonight, I say she burns." Crane spurred forward, rifle cracking. A rider spun from his saddle, crashing into the snow. The outlaws roared in fury, surging forward, but now they faced more than one rifle. The cabin yard erupted into battle. Torches flew, striking the roof, sparking flames. Lien grabbed a bucket, dousing sparks with frantic speed, her fingers raw from cold water and smoke. Daniel and Crane fired shot after shot, each one pushing back Pike's men. Horses reared, men cursed. The white world became a storm of flame and lead. Snow churned red where bodies fell. Torches hissed as they sank into drifts. Smoke curled black against the pale horizon. Daniel took another hit to his shoulder, staggered, but Lien caught him before he fell. Her strength was born of desperation as she whispered fiercely, "Stay standing, please." He shook her off gently, stepping forward into the doorway once more. "A house stands only if its door does," he said, reloading with calm precision. The fight raged through the night, but for every man who pressed forward, another fell to steel or to fire. Still, the circle did not break. Pike's fury boiled hotter than the torches in his men's hands. He raised his revolver, shouting above the chaos, "Cross! You'll freeze in your grave tonight." Daniel's rifle rose slowly, unwavering. "Come take me then." The standoff locked the yard in silence for a heartbeat. Then Pike's hand snapped down. More gunfire erupted, louder, closer. The battle for the cabin had truly begun. The night became a storm of fire and steel. Bullets split the air, torchlight streaked across the snow, and every breath felt stolen from the jaws of death. Daniel fired until the barrel of his rifle smoked. Each shot precise. Each trigger squeezed the work of a steady hand rather than a desperate one. Beside him, Lien fought a different battle hauling water, stamping out sparks, dragging blankets over shattered windows to block the freezing air. Her face was pale but her movements relentless, refusing to let fear steal her purpose. Marshal Crane rode through the yard like a thunderclap, his rifle booming as he scattered Pike's men. "Hold your line, Cross," he shouted. "They'll break." But Daniel knew better. Pike was too proud, too cruel to retreat while breath still filled his lungs. The cabin shook with every impact. Splinters rained from the walls, smoke stung their eyes. At one point, a torch smashed through the window, flames licking the floor. Lien grabbed it barehanded, hurling it back out into the snow, her palms blistered, tears biting her eyes. Daniel turned toward her, a flicker of something fierce and proud in his gaze, but he had no words. None were needed. The gunfire slowed, replaced by the chilling call of a horn. The outlaws drew back, torches forming a half-circle beyond rifle range. Pike rode to the front, his face twisted with fury, beard crusted with frost. He raised his revolver high, his voice booming across the battlefield. "Cross, you're a dead man standing. No one defies Caleb Pike and lives to tell it." Daniel stepped into the doorway, blood darkening his sleeve, breath rising like smoke. His voice, when it came, was iron ground against stone. "Then let tonight be the tale you choke on." The words hung in the frozen air, heavier than gunfire. Some of Pike's men shifted uneasily, doubt creeping into their faces. But Pike spat into the snow, eyes blazing. "We'll burn you out. Every man, every wall, every scrap of your stubborn pride." He swung his arm down. "Light it." Torches flew, arcing through the night. They struck the roof, the walls, the ground. Flames roared to life, licking at the logs, casting the cabin in a hellish glow. Inside, smoke thickened. Lien coughed, dragging buckets with frantic hands, her skin raw and red. Daniel shouldered his rifle again, firing into the circle, knocking torches from hands, dropping riders who came too close. But there were too many. The cabin creaked under the weight of fire, the roof groaning as smoke poured upward. For the first time, Daniel's jaw clenched not in defiance, but in the hard grip of truth. They could not last forever. Then a cry rose above the chaos. Not Pike's men this time, but the voice of a boy high, frightened, yet stubborn. Samuel, the orphan Daniel sometimes helped, stumbled into the yard carrying his father's old rifle. His face was white with terror, but his hands were steady enough to fire a shot that cracked the night. A rider fell, torch plunging into snow. "Get back, boy," Daniel roared, but Samuel only shouted, "You're not alone, Mr. Cross." The words struck harder than any bullet. Daniel's chest tightened, his grip on the rifle firmer, his stance straighter. He was no longer just one man against 70. The storm had called others, and together, even the smallest fire could burn brighter than fear. Pike cursed, rage boiling from his throat. "Then all of you die?" He spurred his horse forward, revolver blazing, men surging behind him in a wave of hooves and flame. The cabin yard trembled as 70 riders descended. Daniel braced, rifle steady, Lien at his side with water and cloth. Samuel crouched behind a fence with wide but fearless eyes. Marshal Crane lifted his rifle once more, voice thundering. "Then make your law against us all." The storm of men and fire crashed against the cabin, and the night erupted into chaos. The yard turned into a battlefield carved from fire and snow. Torches streaked through the night, rifles cracked in rapid bursts, and horses reared as bullets hissed past. Daniel stood in the doorway like an unyielding wall, his rifle booming, each shot deliberate, each one finding its mark. Lien dragged buckets from the barrel, throwing water over flames that licked the cabin's roof, her burned palms raw but her will unbroken. Marshal Crane thundered through the melee, his horse kicking snow high as he fired into Pike's men, scattering them left and right. Samuel crouched behind a fallen fence rail, the boy's hands trembling but steady enough to fire his father's old rifle into the fray. Each crack of the weapon was small, yet it forced grown men to dive for cover. Pike's men surged like wolves, circling tighter, their shouts filled with cruel certainty. But for every push they made, Daniel, Crane, and even the boy forced them back. The snow grew red in places where bodies fell, torches hissed into slush, and the cabin still stood despite the smoke that curled black against the pale sky. Pike himself charged forward, coat flaring, revolver blazing. His voice rose above the chaos. "Cross, you can't hold forever." Daniel fired, the recoil jolting through his wounded shoulder, dropping another rider. His reply was a growl that cut through the night. "Then I'll hold until forever ends." The battle raged on, the outlaws firing wildly, their courage straining against the steady defiance before them. Daniel's shots were fewer now, his ammunition dwindling, but every squeeze of the trigger carried iron certainty. Beside him, Lien wrapped his bleeding arm with strips torn from her quilt even as smoke thickened in the room. Her dark eyes met his, shining not with fear, but with something fiercer belief. The gunfire slowed, replaced by curses and the restless stamping of horses. Pike's men began to waver. They had come certain of an easy kill, yet the cabin had become a fortress, every bullet and every act of defiance striking deeper than steel. Marshal Crane's voice thundered once more. "The next man who steps forward falls by law's hand." Silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of snow against flame. The circle of men shifted uneasily, torches lowering. Some spat curses, others tugged their horses back. Fear spread like frost across their ranks. But Caleb Pike's pride burned hotter than their fear. He roared, spittle freezing on his beard. "Cowards! He bleeds like any man. Watch me end him." Raising his revolver, Pike spurred his horse straight toward the cabin. Time slowed. Daniel, his rifle nearly empty, lifted it one last time. Pike's sneer twisted into triumph as his finger tightened on the trigger. The crack split the air. Pike's body jerked back, tumbling from his saddle, crashing into the snow. His torch sputtered and died. A stunned silence fell over the yard. The riders froze, their leader swallowed by the storm he had unleashed. Then, like a cord snapping, their will broke. Men scattered, horses churning the snow in desperate retreat, curses lost to the night as they fled into the dark. The battle was over. Daniel lowered his rifle, breath ragged, blood soaking his sleeve. His knees threatened to buckle, but Lien caught him, guiding him back toward the fire. Smoke still hung in the air, the logs blackened and scarred, but the cabin still stood. And so did they. Marshal Crane dismounted, his face grim as he surveyed the yard littered with torches and fallen men. "You've made enemies tonight, Cross," he said quietly. "But you've made something stronger too." He tipped his hat, respect in his eyes, before turning back to his horse. Inside, Daniel sank into his chair, weary beyond words. Lien knelt before him, binding his wounds with strips of her shawl, her hands trembling yet careful, her touch both fierce and gentle. When their eyes met, her voice broke into a whisper. "You stood for me." Daniel managed the faintest nod. "And you stood with me." Her tears fell freely now, glistening in the firelight. The storm outside still howled, but within the cabin, a fragile peace had been born. Yet beyond the ridge, shadows still lingered. The night had not surrendered fully, and whispers carried through the snow promises that vengeance would come again. The storm carried the smell of smoke and blood, mingling with the silence that followed retreat. The cabin walls still smoldered in places, but the fire within had been beaten down. Daniel sat slumped in his chair, his body heavy with wounds and exhaustion. Lien knelt before him, her dark eyes glistening with both fear and relief as she bound his shoulder with strips torn from her own shawl. Her touch was careful, but her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "You should rest," she whispered. Daniel gave a faint, weary smile. "I'll rest when I know they won't come back tonight." Marshal Crane stood in the doorway, surveying the scarred yard one last time. The snow was trampled, blood pooled dark beneath the pale moonlight, and torches hissed where they had died in the drifts. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of truth. "You've made Pike pay. His men may still whisper revenge, but they've lost their teeth. Fear broke them tonight, Daniel, and the law, for once, stood with you." He tipped his hat to Lien, his eyes softening. "Stay close to him. Men like Pike aren't born alone. They breed in silence. Together, you broke that silence." Then he turned and mounted his horse, riding back into the darkness. The only sound that lingered was the steady crunch of hooves until even that was lost to the storm. Inside, the cabin felt different now. Not just walls and fire, but something alive, something forged in fire and snow. Lien's hands trembled as she tied the last strip of cloth around Daniel's wound. He reached up, his rough fingers closing gently over hers. For years, his life had been silence and empty rooms. But tonight, against all reason, against 70 men and a world that had tried to swallow her whole, he realized he was no longer alone. His voice was rough, quiet, but steady. "You don't have to run anymore. Not while I draw breath." Lien's tears fell freely then, but they were not only tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a weight finally shared. She leaned closer, whispering as if afraid the storm might steal her words. "Then I will not run. Not from you." The fire popped, sparks lifting into the dark like stars. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering tracks, covering blood, covering the scars of battle as though the land itself wished to forget. But some things would not be buried. Two souls had chosen to stand when the world demanded they bow. And in that stand, something stronger than fear had been born. Not loud, not sudden, but steady like fire coaxed from embers. Later, as Daniel drifted into half-sleep, Lien sat beside him, watching the flames. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like prison walls. It felt like shelter. Her whisper was soft, but it carried through the cabin like a vow. "We are not alone anymore." And outside, the storm passed, leaving only the glow of dawn upon a cabin that still stood scarred, but unbroken. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment, or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel.